10 minutes to go for Gordo, and we go to Walter Cronkite at the Cape.
And down here, Doug, we're expecting an announcement from Mercury Control. Let's go over there and Colonel Powers. Our little alert button went on a moment ago indicating that the Colonel was coming up with his announcement. Might tell you something of the physical setup here at Cape Canaveral. We have our CBS News Control Center here at the closest possible point to Pad 14. It's roughly a mile across these boondocks that are the Sands bit, which is Cape Canaveral. And right near us here, a few hundred yards away, is Mercury Control. Colonel Powers, who has been the spokesman for the astronauts since the Mercury program began, operates in Mercury Control where no newsmen are allowed, and he makes these announcements to us from there from time to time, alerting us by saying he's about to come up as now.
The countdown for the attempted launch of the MA-9 now stands at 11 minutes and 30 seconds. T-minus 11 minutes and 30 seconds and holding. We have encountered some difficulty in the ground-based radar, or rather guidance equipment for the Atlas launch vehicle. We are not able at this time to get a specific identification on what the problem is. We know simply that we do have some problems over there. We estimate at this time that the hold will last about 10 minutes. This is Mercury Control.
So there we are at T-minus 11 minutes and 30 seconds with a hold on the operation because of ground control guidance equipment, which is scattered all around Cape Canaveral here. And Colonel Powers has not pinpointed for us just exactly what piece of equipment has gone awry or how serious the problem is. Perhaps they do not know yet, but again, we do have a hold at Cape Canaveral. The hold coming just 11 minutes and 30 seconds before launch off was scheduled. And certainly up there in the capsule that you see there, Gordo Cooper lying on his couch waiting for blastoff must, if he could cross his fingers in those heavy space gloves he wears, they must be crossed. Mentally, I'm sure his fingers are crossed as he waits for a blastoff in what is supposed to be America's longest flight into space. We'll be back here at Cape Canaveral and in New York with Doug Edwards after we pause a moment for station identification. And now here's another announcement from Mercury Control. Maybe Colonel Powers has something to tell us about this hold.
This is Mercury Control. The countdown on the MA-9 launch is T-minus 10 minutes and 30 seconds and counting. On the basis of the present countdown and barring any further holds, we will be launching at 04 minutes after 8. The countdown again now is T-minus 10 minutes and 10 seconds and counting. This is Mercury Control.
So, whatever the problem was with that ground control equipment, it was fixed in very short order, and the countdown now is in really the critical stages. And as we have said before at these launches, and we haven't thought of any term yet, I suppose we could, we might if we really set our hearts to it, but nothing seems to fit now except tension is mounting. This has been a mission that I would say almost up to this morning. I'm not even sure that yesterday morning we felt it quite so much. Was a mission that seemed to be stricken with a certain blasé attitude on the part of everybody concerned. Great calm here at Cape Canaveral and at Cocoa Beach, and among all of those here at Cape Canaveral for a mission of this nature. But this morning, certainly excitement is high again. One of the more interesting human observations about the Mercury program has been the varied background of these first 7 astronauts. In Houston, well before Gordon Cooper's flight, I asked him about the beginning.
When did you first hear about and get interested in the Mercury program?
Well, I first heard about it when I noted in an article that a particular aircraft company had been awarded a contract for a space capsule. And then very shortly thereafter, I was called to Washington, and we were given what the program was to be, and that we had, a number of us that had gone there had been selected as possible candidates, and were told exactly what would be involved in the program and given a little rundown by engineers and scientists. And then at that time we're asked if we were interested in volunteering. If we were not, nothing would be thought about, but if we were, then there would be a series of competitive examinations of different types started.
You didn't have to make an application then for that. You were interested, but your name also coincidentally came out of the
yes,
IBM machine or whatever.
The first group, we didn't apply. They indicated they were interested in us.
In that first discussion or briefing on what the program was going to be about, did they seem to make any calculated effort to stress the possible danger involved, to kind of scare you out of the program if you didn't have the full devotion for it?
No, I don't think so. I think they gave a very honest appraisal of exactly what was involved and exactly what they were doing to create backup systems and to create systems that would work in eventualities of failures of the primary system, and of the various things that needed to be developed, and of the state of the art on things they knew and things they didn't know. I think it was a very honest evaluation.
And there in Grand Central, a huge crowd is watching this countdown, as are thousands, if not millions, around the world, because some of these pictures will be relayed via the relay satellite to Europe, as were pictures 7 minutes of yesterday's preparation sent to Europe, including Poland and Hungary behind the Iron Curtain. We can't help but wonder what those people behind the Iron Curtain think about the openness of a society that can photograph an event such as this, even as it's happening, with no propaganda built into it at all. And now the count down is getting very close. The shot should come 4 minutes after the hour, so we're approaching T-6. T-6 minutes. The weather perfect at Cape Canaveral, not a cloud in the sky. The weather downrange in the Atlantic, where if anything does go wrong on the launch phase of the operation, Gordo Cooper would be recovered, or if he is brought back after the first, second, or the third orbits, that weather is good. The weather out in the Pacific is good as well. He is not scheduled to arrive at his Pacific destination until 34 hours and 20 minutes after he takes off from here, and if the takeoff goes as planned now, that means Eastern time, about 7:25 p.m. tomorrow evening, the longest flight America has yet had in space, and the longest anybody has taken in space, excepting only the two Russians, Nikolaev and Popovich, Nikolaev having spent 4 days in space last August. We're told now that Colonel Powers has another announcement for us from Mercury Control. Let's switch over there now.
This is Mercury Control. The countdown on the MA9 launch now stands at T-minus 5 minutes and counting. T-minus 5 minutes and counting. As of this time, we have just run a check of all elements of the MA9 launch system, and as of this moment, all elements are go. The count again, 4 minutes, T-minus 4 minutes and 30 seconds and counting. This is Mercury Control.
Certainly if tension is building out there on the pad and around the rocket, it is building as well there in Mercury Control, where the safety of the astronaut is, of course, paramount, and where the last-minute checks have to be run right down to the moment of the takeoff. There you see the helicopters, some 5 Marine helicopters stand by here at the Cape. They'll be taking off in a minute or two to hover just offshore. They are backed by several Larks. Those are amphibious vehicles specially prepared with cranes and rescue equipment, all of them, the helicopters and the Larks, ready in case anything should happen on the pad or in the first few seconds of liftoff. If that happens, that large tower you can see at the top of the Atlas, a 16-foot tower, is equipped with rockets that literally blow the capsule away from the booster, carry it out a safe distance where a parachute opens and drops the capsule and the astronaut in safe and sound shape, we hope, back into the Atlantic right offshore here. That's why the Larks and the helicopter is ready to bring him back if that should happen. And then in the next critical 5 minutes of powered flight, the decision has to be made whether he is on target through a small window less than a quarter of a mile square in the sky out there 100 miles high and over Bermuda. If he hits that little tiny window, if everything is going correctly, then he can go into the proper orbit, 100 to 150 miles high around the Earth. The calculations will be remade after that to be certain he's good for all 22 of the orbits that would give us this long flight he intends. It's T-minus 2.5 minutes and counting here at Cape Canaveral. Atop the rocket, again, a 36-year-old Air Force major, a man you've seen with a big smile, a jaunty air, and a highly developed sense of humor, as well as tremendous skills as a test pilot, to have been selected as one of the 7 most likely men for space travel who became our original astronauts.
This is Mercury Control testing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Mercury Control testing out.
You'll be hearing that Mercury Control voice whenever it comes in again in this next 2 minutes before launch. It's T-minus 2 and counting. We have plugged in Mercury Control so that you won't miss any of the words from there as they come across to us here at our CBS News Control Center. Gordo Cooper has waited a long time for this flight. He is the last of the 7 astronauts, excepting only Deke Slayton, who was scrubbed from this solo part of the program because of a heart flutter. He's the last to make a flight. The first was Alan Shepard, whose flight came early in the same month of May in 1961, 2 years ago. This flight's scheduled to be the last of the Mercury program, although there is talk now of one more coming along before the Mercury program ends and we begin flights in our 2-man capsule, the Gemini, the intermediate step before we go to Apollo and the step to the moon. Now here's Shorty Powers.
This is Mercury Control. Countdown at the MA9 launch is now T-minus 1 minute and counting. As of this time, all systems are go.
It's T-minus 40 seconds now and counting. All systems go. Weather good. Astronaut in good shape, tracking systems around the world, some 20,000.
This is Mercury Control. The countdown stands at T-minus 30 seconds and counting. All systems are go at this time. This is Mercury Control. The umbilical has been ejected.
At this point, the capsule and the booster are on what's called automatic sequencing.
This is Mercury Control. We have a momentary hold at T-minus 19 seconds.
That's not an unexpected hold. It shall be picked up almost immediately.
T-minus 15 seconds and counting. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 2, 1. Ignition, liftoff at 04 after the hour. Liftoff. All systems appear to be operating properly.
It's a long trip, Cooper, but it's a good takeoff. It's a beautiful takeoff. He should be getting vibration now. And now the pitch over.
This is Mercury Control. The trajectory looks very good at this time.
The Atlas pitching from straight ascent to trajectory.
40 seconds into the flight.
If he's going like earlier flights, the vibration's growing for Cooper now. He just about reaching max Q. That's maximum vibration, maximum dynamic pressure.
We are now 55 seconds into the flight. The trajectory looks A-OK at this time. Astronaut Cooper reports his oxygen supply, his fuel supply, and all onboard systems are go.
Oh, it looks like a beautiful takeoff again from Canaveral.
This is Mercury Control. We have now passed through the area of maximum aerodynamic pressure, or max Q as we call it. We're now 1 minute and 25 seconds into the flight. The trajectory looks A-OK at this time, and the pilot reports all onboard systems are go.
That is a vapor trail which is seen as the capsule passes through a strata just about at maximum dynamic pressure. At this point, Cooper is almost 20 miles up.
Mercury Control. The flight is now 1 minute and 55 seconds long. Astronaut Cooper reports his fuel system go, oxygen system go. His cabin pressure is at 6 pounds per square inch, and he reported that the sun was beginning to come into the window. This is Mercury Control, some 2 minutes into the MA9 Fate 7 flight.
Cooper has just had the maximum G's he'll have, the heaviest pressure he gets
This
in
is Mercury
takeoff.
Control. We have just received a report from telemetry and from the pilot that the booster engines have been jettisoned. BECO, we call it here. This is Mercury Control, some 2 minutes and 30 seconds now into the MA9 Fate 7 flight.
And Cooper is now about 50 miles high and about 60 miles downrange, making about 8,000 miles an hour as those two main boosters were cut off.
This is Mercury Control. Our telemetry tells us that the escape tower has been jettisoned. Astronaut Cooper reports he is observed at leave, and we now have confirmation that the escape tower has been jettisoned. This is Mercury Control, some 2 minutes 56 seconds into the flight.
Just about 20 seconds ago, Cooper got his first view of the Earth with the jettisoning of the tower. The capsule pitches down, and he gets a look out of
This is Mercury Control. Astronaut Gordon Cooper in his Fate 7 reports his fuel system go, his oxygen supply go. His cabin pressure has sealed off now at 5.6 pounds per square inch and is holding steady. This is Mercury Control, some 3 minutes and 20 seconds into the MA9 Fate 7 flight.
And now he's 60 miles high and about 95 miles downrange. He's going about 8,000 miles per hour. The first no-go decision of Mercury Control is being made right now.
Mercury Control. All of our indications here in Mercury Control tell us we have a go situation. He has been advised that we have a go situation here. We're now some 3 minutes and 45 seconds into the Fate 7 flight. Cooper reports all of his onboard systems are go, that his cabin pressure is holding steady, that all of the systems are operating properly. Our indications here are that the trajectory is A-OK at this time. Mercury Control with 4 minutes into the Fate 7 flight.
The 27,000 gallons of fuel are gone from the Atlas tanks now. With the tanks almost empty, the whole rocket has become limber. Glenn reported that he felt that the nose was waving back and forth on his booster and rocket. He had a sensation of being at the end of a springboard, he said, just about this point in the flight. That rocket burns more fuel in its first minute than a jet liner burns in a transcontinental flight, for instance. And it goes up with the power of 1,600 locomotives. In another 15 seconds or so, the sustainer engine with the single engine...
This is Mercury Control, some 4 minutes and 45 seconds into the Fate 7 flight. We have had a voice exchange between astronauts Wally Schirra, who is Capcom here in Mercury Control, and Gordon Cooper, who is in the cockpit of Fate 7. Cooper referred to Wally as Cygnus 7, the call sign for his spacecraft on his historic 6-orbit flight. This is Mercury Control. We've got sustainer engine cutoff. We've got sustainer engine cutoff on the Atlas launch vehicle. From the indications here are that the cutoff was proper. Our velocity, altitude, and angular direction indications are right.
That means that the clamp ring blows off, posigrade rockets fire to separate the spacecraft from its Atlas booster, and the booster drops behind at about 17
This is
miles.
Mercury Control. All of our indications here as of this moment are that we have a good separation. is turning his spacecraft around now so that the blunt heat shield is facing forward in the direction of the flight. All of our indications here indicate we have had a completely successful launch, that our Atlas launch vehicle has operated 100% as called for. This is Mercury Control.
However, we should have had by now the go, no-go for the orbit, which normally comes around 5:30 into flight, and we haven't heard it yet. This may simply be that Shorty Powers hasn't communicated to us in those terms. He says that all indications are it's a good flight, but we haven't heard positively a go, no-go for these orbits.
Control. We are having a voice exchange now between astronaut Gordon Cooper and Walter Schirra here in Mercury Control. Wally has just asked him the question, great sport, isn't it? And the response was, sure is. This is astronaut Gordon Cooper's first space flight. He is now some 100 miles in altitude and traveling at approximately 17,400 miles per hour. I will have more definitive figures in just a few moments. This is Mercury Control.
Cooper is at least 100 miles high now. He's some 550 miles downrange at his speed of 17,500 miles an hour, which it takes to put a space craft into orbit.
This is Mercury Control. The Faith 7 spacecraft is now out of the range of Cape Canaveral's receiving equipment, but is in range of the Bermuda equipment. We are receiving his voice reports remotely from Bermuda.
Well, we haven't heard positively a go, no-go for a 7-orbit capability, which is as high as the computers go here at the Cape. We assume that that is the case by what Shorty Powers has said so far about a good flight. The words haven't been used as such yet, and because of the nature of this business, we have our fingers crossed.
This is Mercury Control. Astronaut Walter Schirra is in contact with Cooper aboard the Faith 7. Cooper has indicated that the whole flight and all onboard system looks mighty good at this time, and allowed us how the Atlas launch vehicle that sent him into space is real close. Wally Schirra asked him what color it was, I think more in jest than in seriousness, but Cooper promptly came back with the word silver. This is Mercury Control, some 8 minutes and 30 seconds into the MA9 Faith 7 manned spaceflight.
That Atlas booster, once separated from the capsule, becomes a satellite of its own for about 24 hours before it drops out of orbit back through the atmosphere and presumably is burned up in the fiery descent through the atmosphere. Although we remember from the Schirra flight that a large piece of the booster ended up in Africa. It drops behind the capsule at about 24 feet a second. That's something like 17 miles an hour. And at the end of the first orbit, it's about 24 miles behind the spacecraft. Cooper felt his first weightlessness. It began to set in about 5 minutes into the flight, some 4 minutes ago. And it's just at that point that he swings the craft around, yaws it around.
Mercury Control. We are now some 9 minutes and 30 seconds into the Faith 7 spaceflight. Astronaut Cooper is reporting the temperatures and pressures inside his spacecraft and indicates that all of the systems on board the spacecraft are go. He has made his turnaround and is now arcing high over the mid-Atlantic. We expect to be out of range of Bermuda within a matter of seconds. This is Mercury Control.
So Gordon Cooper is on his way around the Earth, and if this orbit is exactly proper, which will be determined during the first orbit, he will be given a go at that time for probably his full 22 planned orbits. A day and a half in space is the plan for this 36-year-old Air Force major, getting his first trip in space, and the trip that Wally Schirra said, well, Gordo waited a long time, but I think he's getting the best flight of them all.
We are now 10 minutes and 30 seconds into the Faith 7 flight. I'm attempting at this time to get the figures on his velocity and on the orbit insertion, and to be able to confirm orbit insertion. This is Mercury Control, some 10 minutes and 45 seconds into the Faith 7 flight.
So Shorty Powers himself says that he can't confirm orbit insertion at this moment, which seems a little bit strange to us. Normally that comes right at the moment of decision in Mercury Control, which is about 5.5 minutes after launch. That point was passed 5.5 minutes ago now, and we haven't heard from Shorty that it is a go, no-go. This can purely, and probably is, a simple breakdown in communications in Mercury Control, such as we have had before here, that has given us considerable alarm. The most notable case being that of the flight of Scott Carpenter, when actually in Mercury Control there was telemetry information indicating that Scott Carpenter had survived the passage back into the atmosphere when he was trying to make his landing, but we weren't given that information here in the public news media, and the whole world was kept on pins and needles for 45 minutes as to whether he had safely made a re-entry into the atmosphere. We may be having the same problem now with this matter of the orbit. If there is any problem.
Control. We're now 12 minutes into the space flight of spacecraft Faith 7 with astronaut L. Gordon Cooper at the controls. Slightly after burnout of the Atlas launch vehicle, Faith 7 was at an altitude of 100 miles, and that thereby becomes his perigee. We estimate from our figures here at this time that his velocity is 24,417 miles per hour. 24,417 miles per hour.
That velocity is far greater than is normally the case for these orbits.
This is Mercury Control. The perigee, that is the low point in his orbit. We now confirm orbit and indicate the low point of his orbit will be at 100 statute miles. The apogee, or the high point, we estimate at this time will be 164 statute miles. The inclination angle is 32.5 degrees, and the period of the orbit, or the time it will take him to get all the way around, is 88.7 minutes. I might say here, looking at these figures and looking at the plot board across Mercury Control here, that the operation of this Atlas launch vehicle was so close, so very, very close to absolutely nominal or pre-planned that it is almost unbelievable. Faith 7 now is arcing across the Atlantic, approaching the Canary Islands. Again, he is in orbit. He entered orbit at an altitude of 100 miles, traveling 24,417 miles per hour.
One thing we want to clear up from Mercury Control, we're asking our correspondent over there to get us some figures on it, is why the excessive speed of this particular capsule is 20...
Correction, this is Mercury Control. I have now got a correction on the velocity. I was reading feet per second, which is the way the men here in Control Center read it. The corrected figure has now been delivered to me. His velocity in miles per hour is 17,544 miles per hour. I repeat, the velocity in orbit, 17,544 miles per hour. This is Mercury Control.
Well, Shorty Powers gave us a bad time again this morning then with that little bit of information, because that speed is greatly excessive. 24,000 miles an hour would have frightened us. 17,500 miles an hour is the speed of orbit, or should be, and he hit it almost on the head with 17,544. In past cases, it's been right within that same range, 17,487 for Carpenter, for instance, and Nikolaev and Popovich, they estimated at 17,400. Schirra had 17,496. He was the closest yet. The apogee and perigee, the high and low points of the flight, are also within the nominal range. 100 miles high as a perigee is right on target. 164 miles for the apogee is within a few miles of target. And some of the he's within a mile of the lowest perigee we've had, that of Scott Carpenter, who was down to 99 miles. The highest man out was the first man out into space, Yuri Gagarin, whose apogee took him out to 187 miles. So Gordo Cooper is on his way. A day and a half in space, a long, long flight that will carry him, as it is now, almost to Africa and around the world 22 times in the next day and a half. It would take the fastest transcontinental jetliner, if you'd like a little comparison, 49 days to make the same 550,000-mile journey that Gordo Cooper is going to be making before sundown tomorrow. This is Walter Cronkite at Cape Canaveral. Now back to Douglas Edwards in New York.
So as you've seen and heard, Gordon Cooper is well on his way, just over the hump of Africa now. He took off at approximately 4 minutes and 10 seconds past 9 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time. The ride into space will take him over several nations and territories that none of our other astronauts have passed over. He won't go over the Soviet Union, however. The closest he'll get is a passage over Afghanistan on the 11th orbit. From there, he'll be able to peek in at the Turkestan section of the Soviet Union if the cloud cover is right and opens up a bit for him to take a look at it. He'll be over communist China, however, on portions of the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th, and also 11th orbits. Back in a moment. Walter Cronkite from Cape Canaveral. Apparently you're about to hear the voice of Gordon Cooper. The first transmission is recorded for broadcasting.
This is Gordo Cooper talking to Wally Schirra in Master Control during the initial phases of flight.
Roger, we have a good go here, and pitch 50.
That's what they said.
Walter, we have word here in New York that at 6 minutes after launch...
That was the first minute of conversation between Gordo Cooper.
Let's go.
Here's some more.
30 seconds, fuel is go. Oxygen is go. Cabin pressure 6 psi. Roger, pitch 32, looks good. Roger. Sun is coming in the window now. Roger, we're standing by for your beacon. Roger.
Eco is booster engine cutoff.
Running pretty smooth now. Good show. 2 minutes, standing by on beacon. Rush, time act good. Roger, beacon. Roger, your beacon. Confirm staging.
Staging
And
is
you can feel the staging.
staging is
We're
at
good
the
on
sustainer.
Pico time. Pico should be nominal. Roger. And there goes the power. Does she take? Roger, confirm your tower. Roger, retro jettison switch off. Retro jettison switch off. Okay, fuel is go. Oxygen is go. Cabin pressure sealed at 5.5, 5.6 and holding. Roger, sealed on 5.6 and holding. Very good. Pitch -4.
At this point, the capsule is being turned around.
Roger, I agree on pitch. You look real pretty here. She felt real pretty. We have a boat well full of barracuda, and we'll serve squad up forward. Right. All electrical is go. Pressure is go, oxygen is go, Sigma Phase 7 is all go. We have a full go here for you, Gordo. Roger. And this is Sigma 7 down here, buddy. That's what I said, Sigma Phase 7 is go. Roger, Phase 7.
So the full go went to Gordo Cooper, who might become known simply as Go Cooper after this flight. As you see, he's been in...
4 minutes and fuel is still go, oxygen go. Pressure holding. All systems go out is green. Roger, your pitch indication is -4, we concur. Roger. The trajectory looks real good, Gordo. I'll give you a mark on point A. Roger.
This is a videotape of the first... The first televised picture from the capsule.
Roger, clock. Sigma 7, plate 7 on the way. Standing by to start the backup clock. Roger. 3, 2, 1, mark. Roger, and the backup clock is running. Roger, you look good here, Gordo. Roger, feels good, buddy. Great sport.
That's a picture of Cooper in the capsule.
Fuel is go, oxygen is go, cabin pressure on the top, cabin is working. Roger, you're looking beautiful.
Wasn't known whether he'd be able...
That's the beauty of your clocks are in sync.
Wasn't known whether he'd be able to transmit a picture on this takeoff or not.
Fuel is go, oxygen is go, cabin pressure 10 psi on schedule, all systems go. Roger, we have a good go here and pitch 50.
These bars that look like a curtain coming down over the picture.
Let's go. Everyone needs 30 seconds. Fuel is go. Oxygen is go. Cabin pressure 6 psi. Roger, 632. Looks good. Roger. Trying to come in the window now. Roger, we're standing by for you at Pico. Roger.
Those are called phasing bars by our technicians here.
Running pretty smooth now. Good show. 2 minutes. Standing by on Pico. Rush, tarmac, good. Roger, Pico. Roger, you Pico. Confirm staging. And you can feel the staging. We're good on Pico time. Pico should be nominal. Roger. And there goes the tower. And there she takes. Roger, confirm your tower. Roger, retro jettison switch off. Retro jettison switch off.
That's the separation of the capsule from the Atlas booster and the jettisoning of the 16-foot escape tower, which he doesn't need any longer.
Fuel is go. Oxygen is go. Cabin pressure sealed at 5.5, 5.6 and holding. Roger, sealed on 5.6 and holding. Very good. Pitch -4. Roger, I agree on pitch. You look real pretty here. She felt real pretty. We have a boat well full of Barracuda and we'll send squad up forward. Right. All electrical is go. Pressure's go, oxygen is go, Sigma 7 is all go. We have a full go here for you, Gordo. Roger. And this is Sigma 7 down here, buddy. That's what I said, Sigma 7 is go. Roger, phase 7.
So we heard the...
4 minutes, and fuel is still go, oxygen go, pressure holding, all systems look good. Roger, your pitch indication is -4, we concur. Roger.
We have been hearing here the original of the launch of the capsule, and a videotape recording we're showing you of Cooper in flight from his in-flight television camera. A videotape recording of that, and a tape recording of the audio portion, the sound of his communication with the ground as he took off. We have been repeating it to give you every opportunity to hear both the words and to see the picture. Actually, the transmission of both the television picture and, of course, of the audio recording of his takeoff only took place once.
10 seconds to go. Roger, Point north, you're right in there, baby. Step half ring, big call, my long stamp. Point fly by wire.
Actually, the communications have been so much better already on this flight than they have been in any previous flight. As you have been able to tell there, the voices are far clearer, not only from the ground control, the CAPCOM, capsule communicator, who in this case is Wally Schirra, who made the last flight to space, but also from the capsule itself, from Gordo Cooper. And you consider that that capsule is being buffeted by high vibrations and shot into space at a speed that finally reaches 17,500 miles per hour. At the time you were hearing some of the latter portions of that transmission, you can appreciate how serious, how good the communications were. And the videotape pictures were fair too. If we didn't know whether we were going to be able to get any videotape pictures of the takeoff portion of this flight, but as you saw, we did get some. And now in the next 5 passes over Cape Canaveral, we should again get videotape pictures, and then again from the 15th to 20th orbits. When he's within range of Cape Canaveral, we'll get those videotape pictures. This is Walter Cronkite at Cape Canaveral. Now back to Douglas Edwards in New York.
Per hour. We now estimate that his apogee, the high point of his orbit, which will occur down in the vicinity of Australia, will be at 166 statute miles. The period of the orbit is 88.7 minutes. The inclination angle of the orbit is 32.5 degrees. At 8:21, Gordon Cooper was in, 8:18 a.m. this morning. Gordon Cooper was in contact with the controller at our station on the Canary Islands. At 8:26 a.m., he was in contact with our controller at Kano in Africa. He has been discussing his cabin temperatures and suit temperatures and working on adjusting those temperatures during his contacts with the controllers at the Canary Islands and at Kano. At 8:34 a.m., he was in contact with our tracking station in Zanzibar in Africa. The Fate 7 spacecraft is now high over the African continent, about to pass out over the Indian Ocean. Although I am having some difficulty understanding the voice communication.
Here's a brief summary of just what happens during this first orbit of Fate 7. 5 minutes after the Bermuda area, each orbital circuit reports in, ranging from 100 to 170 miles above the Earth. That takes 1 hour and 35 minutes to make the complete circuit, roughly 88 minutes. 14 minutes after the liftoff, the camera mounted above the instrument panel began to relay the first pictures of an American astronaut in orbit to a tracking station on Gran Canaria Island. Of course, you did see some earlier pictures than that on the actual blastoff itself. Cooper is devoting most of the first orbit to checking spacecraft systems and his own physical condition. Blood pressure, oral temperature are being taken early to provide basic data for comparison with readings later in flight. Now back to the Cape and Walter Cronkite.
And an announcement from Mercury Control.
Into the space flight of Fate 7 with Gordon Cooper at the controls. Let me recap quickly here what has occurred this morning. The launch took place at 8:04 a.m. He was inserted into orbit at approximately 8:09 a.m. at an altitude of 100 miles. That 100-mile number becomes the perigee or low point of his orbit. Speed at that time was 17,544 miles per hour. We now estimate that his apogee, the high point of his orbit, which will occur down in the vicinity of Australia, will be at 166 statute miles. The period of the orbit is 88.7 minutes. The inclination angle of the orbit is 32.5 degrees. At 8:21, Gordon Cooper was in, 8:18 a.m. this morning. Gordon Cooper was in contact with the controller at our station on the Canary Islands. At 8:26 a.m., he was in contact with our controller at Kano in Africa. He has been discussing his cabin temperatures and suit temperatures and working on adjusting those temperatures during his contacts with the controllers at the Canary Islands and at Kano. At 8:34 a.m., he was in contact with our tracking station in Zanzibar in Africa. The Faith 7 spacecraft is now high over the African continent, about to pass out over the Indian Ocean. Although I am having some difficulty understanding the voice communications between the pilot and the ground controllers, best information I am able to gather at this time is that all systems are still go. The flight is proceeding as planned. I just contacted Dr. Barry here in the control center, who tells me that all of his information with regard to young Mr. Gordon Cooper tells him that we've got a hale, healthy, and good working pilot. This is Mercury Control, some 33 minutes and 40 seconds into the flight of Faith 7.
And as you can see on our map, Gordon Cooper is just now passing over Zanzibar, out over the Indian Ocean, nearing the midpoint of his first orbit of the Earth of a scheduled 22 orbits. In another minute or so, he'll be north of the Malagasy Republic and on his way toward Australia. He's having some problems adjusting his suit temperature, as you heard, but there's no indication that that is any more than a normal problem in the first orbit. It's a scheduled part of the exercise getting set for the proper suit temperature. Schirra had some problems with his, you'll remember, in the flight of Sigma 7 last October, but they have improved the seat cooling, the suit cooling and the temperature controls, and it isn't expected that Cooper will have any problems with it. A little earlier this morning, there was a momentary hold which gave us all a spot of heart failure there with just 11 and a half minutes to go because of some problem of guidance control equipment here on the ground. George Herman over at the press site has been covering that phase of the story. George, what happened?
Well, at about T-minus 11 and a half minutes, Walter, there was a temporary indication on the radar that something might be wrong. Actually, as it turned out, nothing was wrong. It was just a kind of indication. One of the radar experts says it may have been a voltage drop, the kind of thing sometimes you see on your television set when somebody in the next room plugs in a toaster. Just a slight indication that might have meant something was wrong. It took them less than 1 minute to check it out. They found nothing was wrong, and they went right ahead. Some of the other people from some of the other agencies here have indicated that while they were in that hold, they extended it a trifle to check out a few other things, high-altitude winds and so forth. But actually, there was no trouble, just an appearance of trouble.
Well, as we know, George, just an appearance of trouble is enough to send up the alert flags and the red flags all through Mercury Control.
Actually, Walter, one of the men here says that had this not been a manned flight, had this been a ballistic flight of any kind, they wouldn't even have stopped for 1 minute.
As it was just about a 4-minute delay, wasn't it, George?
It turned out perhaps that long. Only about 1 minute was necessary to check the radar.
Right. And we did get him off finally at 4 minutes after 8, some 36 minutes ago, which means that right now he's just north of the Malagasy Republic, as we said, the island that was once known as Madagascar out in the Indian Ocean. And in another, it'll be another 15 minutes from now, he'll be passing over Perth, Australia, on this first orbit of the Faith 7. Gordon Cooper's spacecraft with which he plans to...
Hello again from New York. Astronaut L. Gordon Cooper, now America's fourth man in orbit, is just about to complete his first swing around the Earth in a programmed 22 trips of that kind. He says space is super, that it feels real pretty, that it's great sport, even though there was some trouble at first anyway with the temperature of his space suit. Well, Cooper hardly had time really to get settled down before he was making history himself, sending back pictures, television pictures from space. For the first time in our manned space program, he transmitted pictures for 7 minutes while flying out over the Atlantic. And now, as he approaches the coast of Lower California, as you can see, he'll be coming in a few minutes later over Cape Canaveral itself. And at that time, we expect to get more television pictures direct from the Faith 7. But now, for the story from the Cape, let's switch to Walter Cronkite.
Down here at Cape Canaveral, Doug, the principal concern has been that matter of suit temperature, although just a moment ago, Shorty Powers, the astronaut spokesman from Mercury Control, told us that this is not giving Mercury Control any serious concern at this time, and right at this moment, they're making the decision on a go or no-go for at least 7 orbits. The retro fire has to come, that is, the rockets have to be fired in another, just about this 1 minute from now, and the decision has to come within the next 50 seconds if he's to return after the first orbit. Powers told us that unless something happened in that minute and a half since he talked to us, he would get a go for a full 7 orbits, which is as high as the computers go at this particular time, and that's all they need to know at this moment. And he expects that decision any moment, and we can expect that decision to be relayed to us from Mercury Control. We'll be advised here just as soon as we get it. The suit temperature figures we've been getting out of Mercury Control are rather confusing themselves, and whether this is a slip of the tongue or whether actually this is what has taken place, we haven't been able to determine yet. But the first figures given from Woomera, Australia, were that his cabin temperature was at 109, his suit temperature at 92, and we were told that this they consider within the normal operating limits. Although a suit technician told us that actually they would like to have the suit temperature at around 85 degrees, and 92 might be a little excessive if they were going to have to run at that for the full 22 orbits, a day and a half in space. Later, we were told the suit temperature was 58 degrees, but I can hardly believe those figures. They wouldn't let him go around some more if that were the case. Apparently, though, there's no concern in Mercury Control, and we expect a decision in just a moment on the go decision for 7 orbits. Now back to you, Doug, in New York.
Right, Walter, the astronaut Gordo's wife and 2 children watched the launch in the privacy of their bedroom in the suburb of Houston, Texas. All Mrs. Cooper would say about the successful launch was the one word beautiful, which is a good enough word in this case. In Tecumseh, Oklahoma, Cooper's mother said, "Don't you know that Gordon is thrilled?" A likely thing, of course, for a mother to say. She and the 2 grandmothers watched it, and when she heard Cooper's voice relayed from space, she remarked, "Well, can you imagine that? That's Gordon." As a matter of fact, it's rather hard for, even now, after 4 men in orbit, it's a little hard for us to imagine that, too. And Gordon's grandmother said, "I'm giving the good Lord the praise. He's directing it. I'm just thankful to the good Lord that he gave Gordon a good start." Back in a moment. At T-minus 30 in the countdown, Gordon Cooper had a conversation with his wife, and of course we were not privy to the exact wording of that conversation. Millions watching today, including the President of the United States. But let's go back to the Cape for the latest developments there. Walter Cronkite.
Mrs. Cooper had quite a few phone calls this morning, Doug. She had one from her husband in the capsule some 70 feet above Cape Canaveral here as he waited to blast off just 30 minutes before flight time, almost on the same schedule he followed yesterday when he called her 25 minutes before he thought he'd be flying off. And shortly after that, she had a flight from call from Dr. Barry, the astronaut surgeon, who called to assure that Gordo was in excellent shape. The time has long since passed now for a go, no-go decision for that 7 orbits. We have not heard from Mercury Control, but obviously retrofire time has passed. He has not chosen to fire his retro rockets and return to Earth, so he is on his way. That 7 orbits is just an arbitrary figure for the scope of the computers. Right now, he is just about south of El Paso, Texas, heading toward a point south of San Antonio, and he'll be passing not very long from now. And just about, just about is passing over Houston, Texas now, and any moment we should be hearing as to whether or not we're going to get 132.53 in flight. He should be over Houston in another minute, over his own home, almost directly overhead, over Trudy and Kamala and Janita, his daughters, on his way toward ending his first orbit. And very shortly after that, he will be turning his television cameras on, and we hope that we're going to get a nice, clear picture of astronaut Gordon Cooper in space on this auspicious day. One of the most important items for Gordon Cooper is that spacesuit of his, the garment that will protect him when he depressurizes, if there were any depressurization in space. None is scheduled. There are some of the tests performed on the suit to make sure there is no danger of a leak. Cooper lies in the same position he lies in the spacecraft when it is on the pad, that is, with his back down, his feet in the air. Placed in a specially constructed couch there, which is similar to the spacecraft one. Under the pressurization of the suit, he attempts to move his arms, as you see here, to test the flexibility and mobility of the suit. Gordo should be turning on that television camera just about now. We're not going to get instantaneous transmission, however, from the camera. It's going to be picked up here at Cape Canaveral, recorded, and then played back to us just as quickly as possible, and just as quickly as the people here at the Cape testify to the security of the tape, of course. They want to check through it first. The camera would be turned on somewhere between Houston and New Orleans, and that should have been just about a minute ago. He is nearing the position, just about north of the west coast of Florida now, just about over Jackson, Mississippi, that is, and on way to his pass just immediately south of Charleston, South Carolina. On this first pass around the world, there have been no untoward incidents except that little problem of the suit temperature, and we have had no reading from Mercury Control lately as to whether there is any concern about it. Obviously, there is not enough concern to have terminated the mission after this first orbit. The mission could still be terminated after the second orbit or after the third orbit, and the astronaut would land in a prime recovery area. That is an area covered by many ships, aircraft carriers, and airplanes right out there near Bermuda. After the third orbit, his path begins to go down deep into the South Atlantic. There are recovery craft standing by down there, but nothing as elaborate as in this prime area. He had just told Gus Grissom, who is the capsule communicator at Guaymas, the tracking station in Mexico just south of the California border, that it is just slightly warmer than absolutely ideal up here. Whether it wants to be absolutely ideal or not remains to be seen. But apparently here at Mercury Control, and as far as Gordo is concerned in the capsule, that is not a consideration at the moment. With almost 1 hour and 37 minutes of the flight passed, he now is passing into his second orbit, passing south of Charleston, South Carolina, out into the Atlantic again. And now back to Douglas Edwards in New York.
Walter Cronkite, what's the news at Cape Canaveral right now?
No more, Doug, except one heartening thing. We have news that the picture from the television camera, that little 10-pound job aboard Faith 7, looks fairly good here at Cape Canaveral. They're taking a further look at it in Mercury Control, and we expect them to release it to us very shortly so we, the public, can get a look at what Gordo Cooper looks like in his capsule, we presume, and also perhaps he will have pointed it out the window. Whether he got any kind of a view of some of these southern cities of the United States that he passed over, we don't know yet. The Houston, Texas pass was just barely within range of the television receiver here at Cape Canaveral, and it's somewhat doubtful that he got a picture of his home and of the manned spacecraft center from his 100-mile height at that time, but we're supposed to get some pictures here soon. Those first ones that we saw a little earlier this morning, I don't know, Doug, I'd like to ask you how distinct they look to you in New York. I was sitting outside here, as you know, at Cape Canaveral, outside of our control center, and quite frankly, with all of the reflections and the light on our monitors there, I couldn't make out very much.
Nor could we, Walter, not a thing. It looked like an unfinished jigsaw puzzle, really, but maybe we'll unscramble it sometime later.
Well,
we'll have a little time for practice during the trips around anyway.
Yeah, our associate here, Sandy Sokolow, has very keen eyes, and he thought he made out the astronaut lying there on his couch. However, I see the United Press reporter says in his dispatch that he saw cloud cover over the United States. So
it looked more like the astronaut to me than cloud cover, but who knows right now.
Well, we might have one of the better guessing games going here, just what the picture does show. As we all know, with Nikolaev and Popovich, the Russian television pictures were quite good. They've had a lot of time to play with theirs, though. They got their first camera up in 1960 for a flight of a couple of their space dogs. The reason why they've been able to put up television cameras long before us is this same reason that they're ahead of us in the manned portion of the space race. I constantly make that reference to the fact they're ahead only in manned space race. The space race is really a minimum of 3 races, the race for pure scientific research, the race for practical applications in outer space, and the manned race. And the first two, practical applications and pure scientific research, we're so far ahead of the Russians, they're hardly in the same ball game. But in this manned space race, they're quite a long way ahead of us because they concentrated on heavy boosters right at the start. And as long as 4 years ago, they had boosters with 1,300,000 pounds of thrust. We're still working with this Atlas booster, which has turned out to be a marvelous workhorse, but it only produces 360,000 pounds of thrust. They've got 1 million more pounds thrust power than we have, and with that, they can put up several tons of spacecraft and all of the gadgets to be included. Part of those gadgets are television cameras. We had to make sacrifices, actually, to get a 10-pound camera aboard this Mercury capsule. Not sacrifices to the safety of the astronaut, of course, because that's one sacrifice that the Mercury program never will make, but at least some of the sacrifices, more consumables, might have been put aboard to prolong the flight or something of that kind. Instead, we got a 10-pound camera up there, and we hope to see the pictures soon for a demonstration. Back here at Cape Canaveral, the word that the flight is going well. Gordon Cooper is well on his way toward that day and a half in space, of which he has dreamed so long. The last of our original 7 astronauts, excepting the grounded Deke Slayton, to make a flight. He is getting the longest of the group to set a new record in space for American astronauts, to trail only Nikolaev and Popovich, the Russians, in this space race. As you see on our animated map there, he is now approaching the Azores. He's passed over the Bermuda tracking stations and the Bermuda recovery ships. He's well on his way toward Africa, the African coast, for the second time. At this time, according to his programmed flight, he is in a powerless flight. That is, he is drifting freely. This is a result, in fact, this whole day-and-a-half mission was made possible by the findings of Schirra on his 6-orbit flight. And his 6-orbit flight was made possible by those 3-orbit flights of Carpenter and of John Glenn's. And of course, they were made possible by the short suborbital flights previously by Grissom and by our first man in space, Alan Shepard, who was the backup pilot for this flight. This flight particularly made possible by Schirra's, inasmuch as Schirra proved that it is possible to drift this capsule in space as Cooper is now drifting his, that is, with no controls working at all, and that it is fairly stable out there. It will not tumble over at such a rate or spin at such a rate in space as to make it uncomfortable or impossible for the pilot to function, even in his weightless state out there. Schirra made those tests, and they proved out. That meant that it was possible to plan a 22-orbit mission without putting as much fuel aboard for the attitude control jets. Those jets which make it possible for the astronaut to position his capsule in the space attitude. You understand, of course, that the capsule is fired into an orbit like a rifle bullet. It has no choice of moving to the right or the left or up or down after that orbit is established. Moving down only if it's ready to move down once and for all, that is to re-enter the atmosphere. That's accomplished by the retro rockets, firing of rockets slowing down out of orbit, orbital speed enough so that he drops out of orbit. But he's now drifting freely to conserve fuel so that he can continue for a full 22 orbits. Now back to Douglas Edwards in New York.
Quick switching to Walter Cronkite at the Cape.
And Shorty Powers of Mercury Control is talking about the flight of Faith 7. Let's go there.
He also had a very interesting exchange of comments between himself and astronaut Alan Shepard, who was our first spaceman, who is now here in Mercury Control working at the Capcom desk. At 9:31, Faith 7 made contact with our Guaymas tracking station. At 9:33, he made contact with our station in Texas. At 9:37, we had contact with him here at Cape Canaveral. At 9:41, we had contact with him at Bermuda. We now have the voice recorded tapes of the exchange between Gordon Cooper in Faith 7 and Alan Shepard here in the Mercury Control Center. We will now turn Mercury Control over to the tape.
Gordon, could you give me a readout on your H2O2 pressures, please? Pressure? Roger. 475 auto, and I have 490 on manual. Oh, Roger, you're getting kind of chintzy on using this fuel up there. Roger, FQI, I'm indicating 101 on auto and 102 on manual. Jesus Christ. You son of a gun, I haven't got anything to talk about. How's your H2O separator lights working? Fine. They're just beating their little hearts out every 10 minutes. Sounds good. Space 7, this is Tony. Maybe the FQI is stuck. Why don't you try the hammer? Let's save that for later. I think they use the hammer on the dome tip, however. On the dome tip slide. We're starting to pick the picture up now. You look pretty casual. Oh, I am. Do you want to do your KK experiment over us, please? Oh, Roger. Holding the KK plan. you open up your TV about one stop. Roger. Is that any better? Sorry, wide open. Roger. I still see that fly on your nose. Okay, girl, I guess you can start your power down. All right, Roger. Going to fly my wire low. Roger. Fly my wire low. Roger, fly my wire low. Down. Roger. Roger, we're tracking volts down and amps down. Shut down. Where the hell is it? About 1:30. It's only one. Apparently, the dome temps are stabilized pretty well now. Roger, it takes a little while to get a grasp on it. Roger. Before LOS, don't forget your TV camera. With those reading you very well now. All right, Roger. And the other item to check is your tape recorder on program. Program. You are programmed. Are you still receiving the TV picture? That's affirmed. All right, I'll turn it off for a moment. Okay.
Those the reports as Gordon Cooper communicated back here with Mercury Control at Cape Canaveral on the pass during his first orbit over this area and out across the Atlantic. A recording delayed by about 5 or 6 minutes in Mercury Control. As you can see now, his capsule is over Western Africa again. He's about over Mauritania at this particular point and is heading around on his second and apparently still a very smoothly running orbit. The suit temperature problem apparently is not giving any great concern at this time. As you heard during those tape reports, there was no particular concern about it, as he communicated with the heart and core of this whole Mercury program, Mercury Control here at Cape Canaveral. As we have reported to you earlier, the launch came at 8:04 a.m. Cape time, Eastern Standard Time. It was a beautiful launch into a cloudless sky, a perfect launch of the Atlas booster, putting the Mercury capsule into a perfect orbit, 100 miles high, and the official correction now 166 miles at its greatest height, its apogee, 100 miles at its perigee, the speed within a few miles of the exact 17,500 for his orbit. Everything certainly at this point looks like a real go for the full 22 orbits, the 34 hours and 20 minutes in space that will bring Gordon Cooper now back to the surface of the Earth in the Pacific Ocean, 80 miles southeast of Midway Island at around 7:50 in the evening, 7:24 in the evening, 7:24 in the evening tomorrow evening. He's got a very long flight ahead of him. Although he's got a lot of experiments to perform in space while he's out there, a lot of the load of reporting to Earth has been taken from him, The ground stations, the tracking stations around the Earth have been asked to not interrupt him too frequently with voice communication, partly to save the battery on his sending sets and partly to save his voice since he's going to be up there that long. We have now been told that the videotapes of the transmission from his television camera made on this first pass over Cape Canaveral. Actually, he's a couple hundred miles north of here in that pass. He was just south of Charleston, South Carolina. But these pictures are available, and in a very few seconds now, we hope to be able to show them to you. Well, I now was waved off from that particular signal, told that perhaps we won't be able to show them to you, at least at the moment we had hoped. We are expecting another signal in any moment that we can take a look at those tapes. Those of you who were tuned in earlier saw what we did not expect to see anything of, and that was a transmission from his television camera actually during the liftoff phase of the flight. We hadn't expected that. The picture was not terribly clear, but it was a picture, some sort of an object from outer space, which we had never had an opportunity to see before. Doug, while we're waiting for this videotape, which we still hope to get for you soon, let's go back to you, Doug Edwards, in New York. All right, Doug, we've got that 1-minute warning signal again that the picture is coming up now in about 45 seconds. Certainly a cliffhanger for all of us while we wait for this first picture, which we hope has a great deal more resolution, which is a little bit clearer than that one we got in blast-off, and it should be. Gordo Cooper is now at this moment with his flight approaching his second hour in space over the center of the African continent, just passing over the Gulf. Just a minute, I'm advised again about that picture. Another minute it's going to be before we get to that picture, Doug. The picture now. Here is the videotape picture. Now you're getting a fairly clear picture there of Gordo Cooper.
Roger. I still see that fly on your nose. Okay, good. I guess you're going to start your power down. All right, Roger. Place fly my wire low. How's it? Fly my wire low. Roger, fly my wire low. Roger. Roger, we're tracking volts down and amps down. About 1:30. It's only one. Apparently, the dome damper is stabilized pretty well now. But it takes a little while to get a grasp on it. Roger. Before I will very well now. Roger. And the other item to check is your tape recorder on program. You are programmed. Are you still receiving the TV picture? That's affirmed. I'll turn it off for a moment.
Well, it's a sort of picture that if you got one like that with a box brownie, you'd be inclined to throw it away. But when you consider it comes from 100 miles out in space, from a spacecraft moving 17,500 miles an hour, and that actually it's not meant to be a compatible television system with that we're transmitting on. That transmits only 3 pictures a second as opposed to scores that we're transmitting, and that accounts for, forget it. Anyway, it's very complicated, phase bars and all that sort of thing, but at least we could get an idea of Gordo Cooper in outer space, and we get an idea also of how little movement he has in that capsule. He was performing a lot of operations, as you heard from the transcript of the tape of the conversation with the ground. He was performing a lot of operations, and we saw hardly any movement at all. It's all with the fingers at the end of the spacesuit. Now back to Douglas Edwards in New York.
Right, Walter, and so Gordon Cooper is well on his way to that day and a half in space. Right now,